Opal, a gemstone so unique that it lends its name to the optical phenomena that made it famous, opalescence. Also called play of color, the milky iridescence of the precious form of opal has captured the eye for millennia. Reds, golds, greens, blues, purples, and every hue in between can be found set against a backdrop of milky white or black potch, also called common opal. The last century has seen the rise of Australia as the premier site of precious opal. But before Lightning Ridge, before Coober Pedy, there was Whelan, home of Washington's forgotten opal. Welcome to Gem City, USA. At least, that's what this area was briefly called at the end of the 19th century. Whelan is a hamlet in Whitman County, southeast Washington state. It really only exists in a technical sense these days, having been assimilated by the nearby city of Pullman, which lies less than 10 miles to the southwest. But back before the turn of the century, before the 20th century that is, well, it was a quiet farming community even then. In the heart of Palouse country, Whelan sits on fertile soil called loess, a fine sediment that was deposited by glaciers and carried by winds to its current location. Only the fine silt and sand-sized grains were carried by winds and deposited in the rolling hills we know today, which are usually covered by crops like wheat, barley, and legumes. But although this quiescent land appears timeless, the loess was slowly built up during the last ice age, with the oldest loess dated at just over 1 million years old, when continental glaciers brought the material down from Canada, and before the ice, this was a land of fire. For 10 million years, between about 17 and 6 million years ago, massive outpourings of basalt lava periodically covered and reshaped the Pacific Northwest. Whelan is less than 100 miles from one of the major chains of vents that erupted the majority of the basalt. 100 miles might seem like a long way, but these basalts repeatedly flowed all the way to the Pacific Ocean from the Washington-Idaho border. Whelan was repeatedly covered in thick sheets of lava during at least 7 different periods, possibly up to 10. And each one of these events sent forth multiple pulses of lava across the land, anywhere from a few feet to tens of feet thick, burying much of the area in lava from anywhere from 150 to 350 feet, depending on the original elevation. It's important to remember that the lava didn't come all at once. Most of it was erupted within a couple million years, but even during the same event, there could be pauses of tens of thousands of years. Between these flows, there were quiet times. Think back to how long the loess has been here. 1 million years. All this, back then, could have just been a quiet time between eruptive events, and any day there could be another flow coming over the horizon to bury the rolling hills once again. Maybe now it's not so difficult to imagine trees and grasses growing and ponds and rivers reshaping the steaming landscape. Of course, we don't need to leave it entirely up to our imaginations. Central Washington has many areas where wood was buried by lava flows and slowly turned to stone.
There's an abundance of just common opal that we can find everywhere, all throughout this region of eastern Washington. Most flows of Wanapum basalt, you can find this common opal. However, I've also managed to find some reds, orange, yellow opal, which is slightly more gemmy.
Ginkgo Petrified Forest State Park and Vantage is one of the more famous locations. Here, over 40 species of wood logs were swept in, either by streams or lahars, in the years preceding the lava flow that buried them. Here and at more than half a dozen areas in central Washington, wood was slowly permineralized as silica-rich groundwater percolated through the basalt substrate and replaced the wood's cellular structure until they became petrified wood. All of this to say, there are many areas where groundwater picked up silica and interacted with basalt. Silica-rich groundwater is a key ingredient of opal formation. Remember opal? This is a documentary about opal.
Opal is a geothermal secondary deposit stone. It forms when a geyser is alive. It carries a lot of silica molecules in the water. When that geyser dies and the heat dissipates, that water starts to evaporate and recede into the rock. It leaves those silica molecules behind and they form net patterns that refracts light. If your silica molecules are perfectly spherical, it'll turn into precious opals. If they're oblong or misshapen, it's common opal. So opal's just a gem silica, and it's around 1% of all opal in the entire world forms color. So to have opal with color, you have to have very, very specific circumstances. Our opal is found in volcanic glass that had existed before it. The other one is found in basalt, similar to ours. Australian opal is found in sandstone. Mostly it's just wherever that the silica molecules can be deposited is where it will form. That's why you can even get them in dirt, in clay that turns into just different types of sandstone over time. And those are more like amorphous opals that flow through your rock, whereas ours is very fixed in position due to the rock having existed before the opal was formed.
Bubbly, oozing lava, perhaps the base or top of a flow, froze with gas bubbles entrained in the basalt, forming vesicles. These vesicles created perfect pockets where percolating groundwater seeped in and deposited their silica supersaturated contents. Opal forms at relatively low temperatures, perhaps not much more than 100 degrees Celsius. Thick basalt flows can stay hot for decades, even centuries, especially if they're buried by even more lava once they're partially solidified.
I'm looking for exposed Wanapum basalt, the upper vesicular half. That seems like everywhere that I've ever seen any type of decent opal, that's a good sign. That's kind of like the one big indicator, in my opinion, that I've tried to chase down. And then access, of course. Spherosiderite is definitely an associated mineral, and it's usually more abundant. When I'm going places, road cuts, things like that, if you see the spherosiderite, that is a good indicator that there's going to be more precious opal. I've never found precious opal or fiery opal or gemmy opal, and there wasn't the spherosiderite in the immediate vicinity.
None of this was of concern to William Leisure. He fished his waters, he tilled his lands, he ate a big sandwich, probably. The story goes like this. Leisure owned 640 acres in Whelan, which he diligently farmed and improved. Among his improvements was the installation of several wells. It was in these wells, beneath 15 feet of loess and a further 10 feet of hard basalt, that the surprise discovery was made. As a practical man of the land, he maybe found them interesting enough to collect a few, but didn't recognize their value. In mid-September 1890, he sent his son to sell the stones in nearby Moscow, at the time a larger city than Pullman. Several businesses passed on the opals before the son approached jeweler James Allen. Allen likely bought the stones, but also followed the Leisure boy back home, took stock of the land, and immediately hired a lawyer and staked out a claim on Leisure's property. The opal rush was on. Word spread quickly in the small town, and it wasn't long before hundreds of local claim jumpers rushed to stake out the Leisure farm and nearby areas. In their fever, the hopeful miners attempted to claim that Leisure only owned the surface, not the mineral rights under the land. Today, they might have a case, as land ownership in Washington is typically separate from mineral rights. However, they would have had to first buy or put up a bond for the mineral rights to acquire a claim. The matter was sorted within a week or two and found in favor of Leisure. He summarily excused Allen and the other claim jumpers from his land. The first wave of opal fever quieted as William Leisure returned to farming. Winter was coming, and the wheat needed threshing before he could be distracted by such matters. With William Leisure's property off limits, opal mining hopefuls were forced to spread out. Some locals cashed out in a wave of land speculation that saw nearby property values skyrocket once the quality of the opals from Leisure's farm was verified. Others, like Chloe Patterson, made deals with speculators. Patterson's property of 160 acres was not far from Leisure's, and William Leisure's sister, Margaret, had married Edward Cabot Hall, an insurance man and occasional mining speculator. Perhaps in a neighborly way, he was able to prospect on Patterson's farm, where he found quality opal that he exhibited at the Spokane Falls exhibition in 1890. And in October 1890, Hall leased the 160 acres for 10 years. Miss Patterson, for her part, was to receive a quarter of all opals and any other precious minerals found on her land. Hull bought the land outright about a year later at the end of 1891 for $11,500. In mid-1891, a Colorado-based company comprising several jewelers and gem dealers was formed with the intent to mine the Patterson property. In short order, they would also take over operations at the Leisure Mine. The North American Gem Opal Mining Company included George F. Glazer, Simon Frankel of Joseph Frankel Sons and Company, Henry Boehm, prominent Denver jeweler, H. Tamman, entrepreneur and future owner of the Denver Post, and E.C. Hall himself. After mining for 2 years, the company bought out the Hall farm in mid-1893, seemingly set for a long and prosperous production when the bottom fell out of the market. A financial panic in 1893 killed demand for luxuries like opal, not just in Washington, but Idaho and Oregon as well. Even precious gems have no value if nobody is willing to buy them. The tough work of freeing soft opal from hard basalt was suddenly not commercially viable, especially when compared to the potential and reliable yield from crops in the fertile soil. At least, that's the story.
So you get a fair number of people coming out here looking for opals?
We used to. Nobody ever found anything because the opals did not develop here, from the heat and the pressure. And we just got some white, milky stuff that wasn't very attractive.
Barbara O'Donnell is a lifelong resident of Whelan, and her family name lends itself to the road that cuts through the old Leisure and Hull properties. She generously showed me the old opal prospect on her land, now overgrown with trees and grass. While not the original Leisure or Hull mine, it does show that she gave opals a chance. But like the original Whelan mines, there just wasn't much there, and it demonstrates how localized that original find was.
It was nothing of any value. And then we had people who came with dynamite and tried blowing holes. And if that didn't wreck the opals, I'm sure nothing else would.
Opals have inherent microfractures in them just due to formation. So you're just extenuating those fractures out and making them break or craze, and it's just not good for them. So doing it by hand, the way that they did it back then, is the best way. So taking a boulder, rather than using conventional tools like a big tractor sledge and stuff like that, I will use a hammer and points, and I'll hammer the points in, and then boom. I'll do it the old-fashioned way. It'll take me an hour or two longer, but I'll still get the job done and produce higher quality opal.
Well, this is pretty much where everything is, right down in here. A man who homesteaded the place, he and his wife, apparently he was married, they only took out the patent to get the money. They didn't want the land, so they did the minimal they had to do under the Timber Culture Act to prove up the land. And the hand-dug well is still there. And the trees were down this way. They all died, and I tore them all out. When he got that done, he sold to Rainey, Albert and Phoebe Rainey. When Albert passed away, Phoebe sold it to Leisure. And then when Leisure's wife, Nancy, passed away, he remarried, and his wife was from the Midwest, and she wanted to go back to the Midwest. And so he sold the place to my grandfather in 1902.
In 1975, Ron Brockett published the second edition of his pamphlet, The Moscow Opal Mines, 1890 to 1893, where much of this history has been collected. He utilized property records, newspaper and journal reports on opal, and living relatives of E.C. Hall and others. But did everything happen the way he wrote it? The official figure from the United States Geological Survey is $5,762 in opal was mined in 1891, with no mining after 1892. With a known figure, we can estimate just how much opal was mined by looking at average prices. Of course, everything from $1 to $125 per carat has been reported. However, the majority of reports suggest $8 per carat is a reasonable average. At $8 per carat, we divide the total sales by 8 and calculate that 720 carats of opal were mined in 1891. There are 5 carats per gram, meaning 144 grams were mined. That's 5 ounces, or almost a third of a pound, over the course of a year. Now sure, this is just a hypothetical, and there may have been more mined, but think about it this way. If there was more opal mined and sold, then that means the opal was worth even less and was therefore lower quality. And on the flip side, if it was more expensive, then even less was mined. One article said Simon Frankel went to Europe with 5,000 carats of the finest quality opal. Another report claimed opal was regularly selling for above $40 per carat, meaning upwards of $200,000 would have gone overseas with Frankel. But when we look closer, the mining company needed investors, newspapers needed sensational headlines or to drum up more interest in their area, and jewelers needed more business. The only source looking at this with a somewhat objective lens was the USGS, and although the writer of the report, George F. Kunz, was the mineralogist for Tiffany's, nobody can doubt the namesake for kunzite was a reliable resource. In fact, it was Tiffany & Co. that dealt with one of the few Moscow opals I was able to track down. Thanks to University of Idaho archivist Robert Perret, I learned about the Gold and Silver book. Perhaps taking inspiration from the school's colors of gold and silver, in 1893 the Pleiades Club commissioned a book cover in literal gold and silver, also inset with many local gemstones. Thanks to some inquiries from a certain documentarian, there are now brand new photos and documentation of the Gold and Silver book that you can find for yourself online. Another early 1900s opal from the Moscow area resides in the collection of the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture in Spokane, Washington. This red and white opal displays brilliant green, orange, and subtle purple hues. Interestingly, it contains both white and red precious opal. Although technically the term fire opal means any opal with a play of color, most people when they hear fire opal think of Mexican or Oregon fire opal with its rich red hues. This type of fire opal is typically a variety called Opal CT, a higher temperature variety of opal. Opal AG, the low temperature form, is the famous type found in Australia and elsewhere. Most likely, the red opal we find in Washington and Moscow is the higher temperature form Opal CT. However, we would need structural characterization to confirm that.
My father and his brother lived across the street, and they decided not to let anybody on the place because they were doing too much damage. The idiot who lived down the road gave my name out to some guy who thought he was going to come mine the place, I guess. And he called me at work and asked me, how do I get there and how do I get to the opals? And I just said, no, sorry. He threatened me. Oh. And I said, you go on the place, I'll call the police. And he was furious.
I've been asked about opal often. Ever since I put up a video showing red and yellow opal being extracted, I've been hounded often by people wanting to know exactly where, wanting information about this, signs, places they can go, the geology.
What about on Leisure's property? Do you think there was some to kind of spark things off?
There's rumors that he found some. My uncle had some that he said he got from Leisure. My uncle was not always reliable. There were some being handed around, and I don't really know where they came from. They said it was from Leisure. They tried to mine it for about a year, and they found nothing, and so they had a longer contract, but after a year they rescinded.
It does bear note that the company bought the mine for $6,600, nearly half of what Hall paid for it 2 years prior. Well logs indicate basalt in nearby properties buried under at least 100 feet of clay, with 150 feet not being uncommon. And that's just to get to basalt. Leisure dug out another 10 feet of hard basalt before finding the weathered layer. And then there's the matter of getting soft opal out of hard rock with minimal damage, assuming the opal has market value to begin with. As we've seen, opal is plentiful in Washington, but rarely has any fire or play of color.
The opals that they supposedly found here were the blue ones. Blue with silver in it was supposedly what they found here. And maybe they got that from what they found that Mr. Leisure had.
I've personally extracted opal with little tiny plays of color, but it not like Spencer or the opal coming out of Australia. That's not a thing that I've personally seen.
You have like your main color bands, which are like your two most common types, which are broad flashes, which is just when it's one color all the way across. Then you have what's called a pinfire, where it looks like somebody just dotted a bunch of colors on it, and it looks like the sky. Then you have rarer color bands, like for example, this one is called a Harlequin. That is a rare color band. They're typically not found very often. And you can also get mixes of color bands as well. You can get Harlequins mixed with broad flashes. You can get overlapping color bands. The best thing about our opal is because of its horizontal layering structure, you can get micro layers of color stacked on top of each other, and they'll form new, unique, one-of-a-kind bands that you'll never see ever. So, just a very unique formation.
Descriptions of Whelan opal ran from the common color bars to the rarest of all, black opal. This was just before the Australian black opal fields of Lightning Ridge were discovered. Newspapers and industry articles painted vivid pictures of Harlequin opal on which the patches of color are made angular and variously tinted but evenly distributed. They are of the variety known as Harlequin opals and are frequently of great brilliancy and in every way of excellent quality. Black opal, with good fire and great value, was supposedly found in the Hall mine. Deep green flashes of color vary in color from an opaque white to dark purple and brilliant fire red. All the colors of the kaleidoscope, from yellow to red, white to bluish white, and a lovely mingling of red, blue, and green.
A kaleidoscope of colors, that's what we refer to more as like our pinfire. Like, even this one would be considered more of like pinfire-y. It's in that stage between pinfire and Harlequin. So these are red opals, where, especially like this one, where it has that bright red flashing in it. This is one I would consider more of a purple. These two are also really good examples of like a red and more of like that purpley black color. Black opal from like Australia is one of the rarest opals on the planet. It goes for around $6,750 a carat to between $20,000 a carat. Our mine does produce black opal. It happens when our pink opal has so much iron in it that it produces a blackish purple hue. That is an exceeding rarity. For us, we don't really know why it happens, although that it has that huge amount of iron in it. But it is a more special thing. You can actually find them on our mini mine. Although be aware that there's like only 10 of them in existence, so rare. When you start getting into rare color bands, you start getting into unknown values and unknown things because you can't see that color band until it's cut. That's the special thing about opal. You can only see its edge.
For some reason, some historical accounts ignore Whelan entirely. Whether one believes everything in the newspapers, Whelan and the Moscow opal mines should be recognized as the first commercial opal mines in the United States. However, that doesn't mean Whelan is set to become Gem City again, which, by the way, it was only called that in one publication. It's my opinion that, yeah, a few small opals were discovered on Leisure's property, and opal fever did the rest. It was a gamble, and remember, this was the generation of the gold rushes and silver rushes of California, Colorado, and elsewhere. Sometimes the gamble paid off, but opal hunters should leave the farmers of Whelan alone and be aware that rockhounding guides often regurgitate the same misinformation that they read in other guides or from historical reports like Brockett's pamphlet, usually without visiting the sites themselves. That's something Jared is used to dealing with.
We don't have enough information about opal out here, so hey, I'm as good as anybody to go poke around and explore old rock quarries and try to chase things down. It seems like you're chasing a vertical vein, usually, and Wanapum basalt can be tough, but it's vesicular, so you can crack it. In the instance of some of the stuff that I've done extractions on, we have these vertical seams in the basalt, and chiseling in a kind of a cone fashion and breaking that basalt out in going for it. Seems like the best extraction method. I would give it a 7 out of 10 on the difficulty for extraction. The smectite group of clay minerals is directly associated with it, as well as I've seen some association of stacked blades of calcite in some of the vesicles as well. But primarily it's the spherosite, is the abundant giveaway because there's so much of it.
If you want to be sure to find gem quality opal in the Pacific Northwest, your best bets are to visit the Spencer Opal Mine in Idaho or the Red Opal Claims in southern Oregon. Washingtonians looking for black opal in their own backyards will have their work cut out for them, if there are even other deposits like at Whelan.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. There's absolutely high quality, gemmy, colorful, precious opal deposits somewhere in eastern Washington. 100% confident in that. The downside, that as I see it, is the areas that it will be in, and it's all under farmland. If somebody was so inclined to build some overlay maps of Wanapum basalt, public lands, known opal finds, and hydrothermal activity, you might find your own opal claim.